In August 2014, the body of a 15-year-old indigenous girl from Sahik First Nations in Manitoba named Tina Fondane was found in Winnipeg's Red River wrapped in plastic. Tina's death was a turning point that opened up a lot of people's eyes to this epidemic and sent job waves across the country. For many, it highlighted the failures of the system. According to a report released in 2014, 1,181 indigenous women were murdered. In order to understand the story of Tina's life and death, it is essential to first recognize the history of colonization. This includes the residential school system and the 60s school, and their lasting impacts on social, psychological, spiritual, and economic health of indigenous people and indigenous communities. Like so many, Tina's parents were significantly impacted by historical traumas, their struggles with housing, intimate partner violence, addictions, and mental illness. All this can be directly tied to Canada's history of colonial practices and the implications of this history that continue to exist today for so many indigenous families. From the 1840s to the mid-1990s, some 150,000 indigenous children were removed from their families and sent to church and government-run Indian residential schools. Their aim was to kill the Indian in the child by assimilating them into dominant Canadian culture. Many children suffered emotional, physical, and sexual abuse while attending these schools. As we know now, Indian residential school was a failed experiment that did a lot more harm than it did good, and unfortunately, that history of family separation over so many generations continue to this day with child welfare. When looking for answers why the indigenous women are so vulnerable, we came to understand that when British conquered or came to Canada, the indigenous people were sent to reserves. Their land were taken. They became homeless, and all the children were taken to foster homes, and they were adopted by white parents. And most of the children that were taken to foster homes had less practical skill that they need to have in their life. And when they became 18, they went to the streets. They don't know what to do. Most of them are uneducated, and they didn't got a job. They end up being in the streets. They were vulnerable. They became addicted to drugs, alcohol, and many more. And people started taking advantage of them.
The event that changed Tina's life was the violent and sudden death of her father. Tina was 12 years old when he died, which is a critical time of development and discovery of all children. And the impact of his death was profound.
Despite all the other details of his history, Tina loved her father as any child would. What followed was significant sadness that grew and expanded until it began to manifest in difficulty at school, experimentation with drugs and alcohol, running away, increasing violence, and being sexually exploited. After her father said she was living with her paternal grandmother, on January 30, 2014, Tina was involved in a family disagreement. Tina expressed her anger by inflicting superficial cuts on her forearms with a pen. RCMP were conducted by the family and reported that Tina had cut her arms and locked herself in her room. Paramedics were called to the home and transported Tina to the Pine Falls Health Complex. When asked by a nurse, Tina indicated she had never self-harmed before and denied having suicidal thoughts. What could have possibly gone wrong? I would say everything. Everybody around her are equally responsible for the horrific fate Tina had to encounter. This is just one story out of the 1,181 stories.
It's time to take a hard look at this country's progress on reconciliation.